Welcome to my session. Today I'm going to talk about delivering Office 365 from a terminal server environment. It was originally planned as an RDS session, but I wanted to include some of the different other partners, such as Vmware and Citrix, so it's also part of the agenda. Anyways, I'm going to start with the easy part, just talk briefly about myself. My name is Marius. I work as a system engineer for a company called Exclusive Networks. We're a distributor here in Norway, focusing mainly on software-defined data center, storage, networking, and so on. And I dabble a lot with data center. I work a lot with Azure and Office 365 as well. So that's why I wanted to have this session here today. If anybody wants to contact me, you can contact me on social media, email. You can poke me at the Nutanix stand outside in the expo area if you have any questions or follow-ups, and so on. So, the agenda for today, I'm going to talk briefly about an overview of terminal services as such, and how Microsoft has, how RDS has evolved over the last couple of years, because there's a lot of new features that not everybody's aware of. And then I'm going to jump into a brief comparison of the different display protocols, such as PC or IP, Citrix, ICA, and so on. And then I'm going to jump into setting up Office 365 and what the challenges are, how we can fix them or compromise, and talk a little about user access, activation, delivering, click to run, Office, Outlook, and Skype for Business, and so on. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the network requirements and things you need to think about. And after that, I'm going to go into a demo and show how all these things are done. So, terminal services. And this clicker doesn't work. There we go. The main idea behind it is that we have all these different users that have all these different devices, iPads, laptops, and so on. And of course, we want them to be able to access our internal applications and be able to actually generate some useful information or data that we can use. So, terminal services in Microsoft has come a long way since NT in 2000. And the main reason behind it is that Microsoft has done a great job in 2012 introducing something called RemoteFX, which is basically an umbrella feature of different sub-features. So I'm guessing everybody here has a familiarity with RDP as a protocol, right? Everybody uses RDP to manage or access their home environment, maybe. But before, in 2008, it was called terminal services. In most cases, it wasn't really reliable over a WAN connection. But in 2012, Microsoft did a great uplift in terms of features. So for instance, they introduced something called RemoteFX Adaptive Graphics, which means that Microsoft will look at, for instance, if I open Internet Explorer, they will separate images and texts and de-encode it, compress it, send it over the wire. So from user experience, it looks a lot better. They have RemoteFX vGPU, which allow us to, if we have a physical GPU card present in our server, we can split it up into different shares and assign resources to virtual machines. And of course, we have multi-touch USB redirection, meaning I can have a USB device plug out and plug in my client, and will appear in the session. Multi-platform support. It's not only Windows anymore. You can use a Mac, Linux. You can use mobile devices as well. And of course, we have media remoting, which will then compress media, send it across the wire. And of course, all this can now be used over WAN using RemoteFX over WAN. So when you use an RDP connection, you're actually using a lot of these sub-features, but you're not always aware of it. So that's the evolution of RDP as such in 2012 and 2012 R2. So what about the differences between the different display protocols? Because our goal when delivering a terminal service is, of course, the end user experience. So RDP as such has always used TCP port 3389. but they can also now use UDP as well. Now, when you fire up an RDP session over 3389 or TCP, works fine. But when you start using UDP as well, Microsoft will start delivering audio, video over the UDP channel. Now, the reason why we will use UDP instead of TCP is that UDP is much less overhead. There's no form of acknowledgement like we have in TCP. And of course, RDP is native in the operating system. So we have PC over IP, which is something that VMware uses in Horizon View, which is UDP based. They can fall back to RDP if it cannot use PC over IP. It's included in Horizon View, requires an agent on the host. But it's much more useful when you have network connections over high latency. And of course, we have Citrix, which has their protocol called ICA, which is primarily used as a TCP protocol, but they have different sub-protocols such as Framehawk, which uses UDP, which is much more efficient in high packet loss scenarios. And we have Vmware, which uses TCP and is much more suitable over high latency networks. So as an example, we tested an ICA session across when we were taking the Kielferje. We had 1800 milliseconds and the connection worked fine. So, thing to think about is that when you're setting up this kind of solution, you need to think about your requirements in terms of what kind of endpoints my users have. Is it thin clients? Is it Mac, Linux, and so on? Where are they going to be able to access? Can they sit on the cabin up in the mountains and use the 4G connection to be able to connect? And if you have other type of requirements, such as GPU support, other media type of features, and so on. So, what's the challenge by delivering Office 365 in a terminal server environment? You know, the good thing about it is that we have all these heavy platforms. We have Skype for business or Link, and we have SharePoint and Exchange, which require a lot of manpower to be able to operate from a day-to-day basis. But now we actually outsourced everything to Microsoft. We pay a per user per month subscription. But then we get another issue, which is latency. And of course, if we have a low bandwidth connection out as well, it's another challenge. So on the one hand, we have the users, which use some form of connection, terminal connection, RDP, Citrix, and so on, to access all their applications inside your data center. And they start Outlook, they start Word, and so on. And then again, it needs to connect to Office 365, which might be located in Ireland, Amsterdam, or wherever Microsoft has their data. So latency is a big issue. So what we're going to discuss is how we can, compromise and be able to deliver a good user experience regardless of the latency that we have. And of course, Office 365 has another way to deploy and deliver Office Pro Plus, client packages, and so on. And of course, we need to think how to set up user access and delegate control. But the goal should be delivering a good end user experience, right? So, I'm guessing everybody here is familiar with Office 365. It hasn't changed that much in terms of the pillars it stands on. We have Exchange, SharePoint, Skype for Business. We have Office Pro Plus. We have Office Online. And we have Azure Active Directory, which is the identity catalog, which we use underneath. So when we create a user in Office 365, it is created in an Azure Active Directory tenant. But Microsoft is now adding more and more features on the top here. We have Yammer, social media. We have Power BI. We have native MDM functionality in Office 365. And we can also include Intune if we want more information rights management. So it's becoming quite a huge platform. And of course, it's available in different editions: enterprise, education, business, and so on, depending on what we need and what our requirements are and amount of users and such. But let's start with setting up user access. So as I mentioned, there's 3 ways we can set up users. We can either do it manually, go into the portal, create a username, account, and we're good to go. Or in most cases, we have an existing on-premise Active Directory identity catalog that we want to be able to continue use in Office 365. So what we do is that we have something called Azure Active Directory Connect, which is a synchronization engine, which basically connects to your local Active Directory, synchronizes out the user objects, creates a user in Azure Active Directory. So it's pretty simple setup. Takes about 5 minutes, requires a server to run on, access to Active Directory to be able to read the user objects and so on. And Azure AD Connect also has a feature called password hash synchronization, which will then take the user object, sync it out, take the password of the user, run it from a hash algorithm, and send the hashed password out to Azure Active Directory. So when the user tries to authenticate to Office 365, he can continue to use his existing username and password to authenticate. So all the authentication happens in the cloud. So it's simple. Allows our users to use the same username and password. On the other hand, we have something called federation. Requires a bit more setup. We need to have a federation services server. We use a combination of that and Azure AD Connect. We synchronize out the user object, but we don't synchronize out the password. We set up a realm trust between Microsoft and our own existing infrastructure. So when a user tries to authenticate in a federated setup, authentication will happen locally on the local Active Directory. So it requires also that we set up a server which has an external public IP address and a certificate as well. So it requires a bit more setup. So when should we choose one over the other? When using Azure AD Connect with password hash, we get something called same sign-on. Basically, we can use the same username and password, but we don't get the full single sign-on experience that we want to have because it's outside of the trusted realm. So in that case, we need to use federated access. Also, if we have, for instance, audit policies in place on our local Active Directory, they will only be able to work if we have a federated access. We can't enable audit policies in Azure Active Directory. If we have, for instance, multi-factor authentication solutions like SMS passcode, SafeNet, and so on, they can easily integrate into federation services, but not directly into Azure Active Directory. Then we would need to use Microsoft's own solution, and so on. Of course, we don't need to use federation services. We can use other options as well. VMware has their own identity manager product, which can deliver the same features, and we can also use Citrix NetScaler to be able to function as a federation server or any type of SAML-based identity provider. So after we now set up the user access, delegated license, and so on, we need to think about delivering Office as a product to our servers. The first thing I'm going to talk about is something called shared computer support, which is basically the feature which allows us to use or install Office 365 Plus in an RDS environment. So this is a feature that was introduced in 2014. I think it was December-ish. And the way we configure it is basically using the deployment tool, which we're going to show afterwards, or we can, if you have an automation tool, we can configure it using registry scripts. So what will happen if when we configure shared computer support, the user logs in, starts Word, this screenshot's going to appear when he needs to authenticate with his Office 365 username and password, and it's good to go. So what's going to happen is that Office is going to create a token, which is non-readable, by the way, stored in the local app data profile of the user, which is a bad thing, but I'm going to get to that in a while. So the next time the user quits Outlook and starts Word, the token is present. He doesn't get any naggy screenshots. He doesn't need to authenticate because the token is present. So the token will automatically renew if it's about to expire and the user is logged in. It also requires that the servers has direct internet access to Office 365. There's an unknown limit of activations. It says so on the technical article. Unknown amount. And the problem with that is if you have a farm of 5, 10 servers like most people have, and the user logs out, generates a token, logs out, logs into another server, needs to authenticate again. Now, I've tested it, and when I've gotten up to 7 activations, the user will get an error message when starting Word. Now, if we have federated access, we can actually bypass this feature as such, because you have something called automatic activation. So if you have a federated setup, it's then you can use the automatic activation feature. It's enabled by default now, so the user doesn't get logon screen. The client will automatically try to activate with the user identity that it's already present. If it's not activated, you can activate it using group policy. I'm going to show you afterwards, and then you just add the federation site to trusted sites in the Explorer zone, and you define that it should automatically log on using the Windows credentials. Now, the last thing, could I have done this using plain password hash? Like as I said, when a user starts Outlook, he logs in with username and password. The token is generated locally on the profile. If I have any profile management tools, could I be able to roam the token between machines? No, I can't, because the token is bound to the machine the user is logged onto. So, next we need to deploy Office Pro Plus to our users, which is basically done using something called the Office Deployment Tool. It's pretty much a setup.exe file, which has 3 different parameters. It has /download, which actually downloads the Office 365 packages. It has /configure, which allows us to install Office. And you have something called /packager, which is going to create an appv package of the Office 365 installer. And when you specify the different parameters, you always have to point to a XML file where the configuration is stored. So it's a XML file which defines what kind of Office we want, version, and so on. So I'm going to get to that in a little bit. Now, when we deploy Office using the configuration XML file, we can use group policy afterwards to override any default settings or make it more granular for specific users and user group and so on. And as I mentioned, we can configure it to use to be an appv package. Then we can distribute Office 365 using our existing appv infrastructure, or if you have System Center Configuration Manager as well. And then we have more flexible methods of delivery, because we can use the cache mode in appv, or we can use the streaming feature, and we also get track usage licensing feature as well. But if we create an appv package, so it needs to be run on a clean virtual machine with nothing else installed, kind of like the same we do when we're doing sequencing with appv. We cannot edit the package with the sequencer package in appv. We need to enable scripts on our appv client as well. But deploying Office as such can either be done using group policy, we can use the appv feature, or we can use System Center Configuration Manager, or any type of deployment tool which allows us to run a setup.exe file with parameters, basically. Now, in order to do updates, we can also do that using configuration file, the deployment. With Office 2016, Microsoft is moving forward with a more, you have different branches and different versions coming, so updates for Office 2016 can be handled using Windows Server Update and Configuration Manager as such. Or we can still use the configuration-based deployment type. So this is an example of a configuration XML file. So the first part here is to define the bit addition, 64-bit or 32-bit. I define the branch because this is a 2016 configuration XML. I define what kind of languages I want to include. If I want to have updates enabled, what kind of branch, and where should my Office clients get their updates from. So this can either be set up to go directly to Microsoft or point to a share, network share. And I can also specify the target version that I want to have installed. So let's say I want to do an update. I download the latest version of Office, and I update the configuration XML file to the latest version on the target version ID, and I deploy it. It's going to fetch the latest version from the network share and deploy it. And of course, the most important part, shared computer support licensing value equals 1, which basically allows us to run it in a shared computer environment. So when handling updates, we want a new version. There's a couple of ways we can do it. We can use a click to run executable, which is installed locally. We can define a /update and specify the version we want to run. This is a manual operation. If you want to set up the latest version on a single version machine, for instance. But in most cases, we define a network share. We define a custom configuration XML file. We define a target version. We define updates enabled. We specify the path. Where should Office get the latest version from? And we define a deadline. When is the latest time the Office should be updated? So when a user is logged onto an RDS computer, it's going to get nagged with this type of screen eventually when the deadline is getting close. So the user, we can also hide the notification if we want to, because that's also part of the configuration, but we want our users to be able to save data before the Office application closes, right? So as I mentioned, Windows Office 2016 handled by WSS and System Center. So, the big elephant in the room. Who here has had troubles with a corrupt OSD file or PSD file? Okay, so those raising your hands, they're either not using Outlook or you're lying. The OSD file, or Outlook data file as it's called, is when Outlook tries to cache content in a local data file. So it's email, it's calendar, it's attachments, shared folders, and so on. And by default, it's created under something called local app data, which again is a bad thing, but it's locally to the user. In earlier releases, it wasn't supported to have it on a network share. But it is supported now if we're running Outlook 2010, Service Pack 1, if the share has enough bandwidth, enough I/O, storage I/O, low latency, and if the user only has one OSD file present. And Microsoft will also not troubleshoot any if things are going slow, if you get a corrupt OSD file. So they're supported, but they won't help you troubleshoot if you're getting into sticky scenarios. So what I most cases recommend is that Outlook can either operate in two features. Either you have cache mode, which basically will cache everything locally, or you have online access, which means that the Outlook client will read and write directly to Office 365 and not store anything locally. But in most cases, I recommend that we set up cache mode in policy, which is going to store X amount of data for a specific amount of time. You can specify 1 month of cached mode or 3 months and so on. So what I typically recommend is that we set it to 3 months cache mode, specify that the OSD file be stored on a network share. So in case the user logs out, logs into another server, the OSD file is present. Doesn't need to build up the OSD file again. And you can also specify that in some cases I've seen that when a user starts Outlook in cache mode, the OSD file starts to populate. Now the user then quits Outlook before the OSD file is finished building, and he logs out, logs in again, and the OSD file starts all over again. So what you can do is that you can start by configuring it to 1 month, for instance. You specify that you should only download the headers and not the full items. So only headers means that you only get the subject title and who it's from and so on, but no attachments, and you don't see the message. But you can users should be able to use it for instant search, for instance, when you're searching Outlook. Yes. create a new one. Yeah. If you have any profile management tools, they might be able to handle it for you. So we can use the cache mode. Another way we can do it is using profile tools as such, or we can use layering tools, which have their own way of storing the OSD file as such, merging the file system. So when it comes to OneDrive, the problem with OneDrive is that it's cheap storage, huge storage. You don't have any enterprise management capabilities with it. You can't store it on a network share. No central management as such. So each user can have up to 1 terabytes of data now each. So if you install it in an RDS environment, the users start syncing all their data, you might get a storage problem, right? Now it's possible to manage it using third-party tools, but in most cases I do not recommend installing it in an RDS environment. And a simple way to do it is to add this line to the configuration XML file when you're installing it, which will basically exclude OneDrive from installing. Yeah, it was called Groove before before it renamed to SkyDrive and then OneDrive. So, Skype for Business. So how can we deliver Skype for Business from an external user when they're accessing our application remotely? They can always have the client installed locally on their computer, but maybe in most cases they don't have it and we don't need it. So what if we start a Skype for Business video call on an RDS host using RDP, for instance? So in most cases, if you have, Skype for Business uses a combination of different protocols, but mostly is UDP-based traffic, right? So if we start Skype for Business video chat using native RDP without UDP, it's going to get a tromboning effect because a lot of traffic is going processed between the session host and Office 365 and the other user, and then RDS host needs to compress the data using the different algorithms that it has and send it back to the end user, which pretty much sucks basically. On the other hand, we can use native RDP with UDP because then the session host it's still gonna need to use a lot of CPU and memory and disk to actually be able to compress the data and such, but you might get a better user experience because the audio is going over UDP and such, and the video as well. And the same goes for PC over IP, which is UDP based as well. And Citrix ICA, which is TCP based, suffers the same problem that RDP has without UDP. We can, however, set up that Citrix use audio over UDP, which might fix the audio issues, but not the video as such. Microsoft also has something called the VDI plugin, which basically solves our problem because what it does is that it offloads the session host back to the end user client. The problem with it is that it doesn't support Office 365 and such. It only supports on-premises Skype for Business. So, but Citrix has their own something called HDX optimization pack, which pretty much does the same thing. It offloads the session host down to the client. It works with Office 365 and Office Click to Run. So to make this a little bit more explainable, as I said, when we have our users on the one end starting remote connection to our data center using some form of remote protocol, they start Skype for Business using video chat or whatever, and it's going to generate a lot of CPU, memory, and even perhaps GPU on the session host. And then there's a lot of traffic going between your gateway and session host to Office 365 and then going back again and then going out to the user. So consuming a lot of bandwidth, you get a poor user experience and more load on your servers. Now with optimization pack, what we actually do is that we have our client, which is called Citrix Receiver, installed on my computer. We set up a connection to our Citrix environment. We install some specific components, which is called the real-time media engine, which we install on our end-user computer, and we install another component on the server. We start Skype for Business, and then we set up a video call. What will happen is that the Skype for Business client is going to set up a SIP connection to Office 365 and to the other user, but the end computer is going to do all the rendering and have a direct connection between the Office 365 and the user. So all the traffic is going to be rendered locally. But from the user perspective, they still see the Skype for Business client running inside the terminal server. So then we get the benefits that we want. We offload the gateway as well with a lot of additional traffic, and we get a much better user experience. So I'm going to show this afterwards, so it makes a lot more sense. But on the other hand, it requires a specific Citrix license and works for Linux, Mac, and Windows only. Now, in terms of network requirements, so these are just numbers that I've calculated based upon the bandwidth calculators that Microsoft have for link, exchange, so on. So let's say we have about 2,000 heavy users using Outlook in online mode. So the Outlook client is talking directly to Office 365. At peak, it would generate about 20 megabytes per second of traffic. But on the other hand, if we used cache mode, for instance with 3 months of cache data, so only new emails going in and out. So when a user is trying to search up an email, it goes locally on the cache file, if it's stored there. Then we can pretty much go down to 10 megabytes per second of traffic in pure network traffic going out. So if we have also 2,000 users using audio calls in Link, running from our terminal servers, this will generate about 110 megabytes at peak. So this is just audio calls, not video calls. And what if we have the same amount of users using RDP as well to connect to the terminal servers and start Link from there? So RDP for 2,000 users running Office will generate about 180 megabytes of traffic at peak. If we combine the two, we have about 300 megabytes of traffic going in and out of the terminal servers. So what if we had optimization pack installed? Then we would offload a lot of the traffic and the link traffic down to the end user computer instead of going through our gateways. Now, another thing we need to think about is managing Office 365 updates. So if we set up the updates to go automatically, they will go directly to Microsoft and download the latest packages, or we can define running from a network share, which we should do. Another thing is DNS placement, because Microsoft or Office 365 use something called geo-based load balancing proximity, which means that the DNS server from Microsoft is going to respond to the closest available resource. So I had a client which had offices in Norway and in China. The DNS server was in China for, I don't know why, but it was stored there. The clients in Norway used it as a DNS server, and the clients in Norway wanted to access Office 365. So what's going to happen? Client is going to ask its DNS server, where is Office 365 located? And the DNS server in China asked the nearest available resource in Asia. And then the DNS server responded back to the clients in Norway, and the clients in Norway started using Office 365 from China. We also need to think about NAT rules. So what I mean by that is if we have one or more public IP addresses used in a NAT configuration from our servers, there's only about, you can only have about 5,000 active connections in Outlook on a single IP address, which is if you have NAT enabled. So you need to think about the required public IP addresses if you want to deploy Office 365 for a lot of users. Now also, if latency is becoming so much of an issue that it's affecting the user experience badly, and if you have a lot of money as well, you can buy something called ExpressRoute from Microsoft, which will basically give you a dedicated line directly to Microsoft's own data center over a low latency link. Or you can use WAN accelerators, which optimize the TCP frames. They have caching, which allows basically to cache files which are downloaded from SharePoint or an Exchange and so on, to store a lot of the minimize the bandwidth usage as well. And of course, if you're using OST files, you need to think about the net storage traffic going to the shares. So remember, try to use SMB version 3 and try to tweak it as such so it works properly. So other things I want you to be aware of before we go into the demo. There are some free tools from Microsoft which will basically can do some research for you. So we have the performance analyzer tool, which will then see the network connection, how much bandwidth is available, how are the TCP settings configured on this computer. So you will basically run it from a computer or virtual machine from within your data center. We'll also check the DNS server, if it's located close to your resource and such. So I'm going to show that afterwards. And we have the configuration analyzer tool, which can be run after installation, and it will check what version are you running. Are you running the latest version? Has shared computer support licensing enabled and such. Now, there are also a bunch of different Office policies that we can disable to make it consume less bandwidth. So Microsoft is very fond of animated menus and graphics and so on. So they also consume a lot of bandwidth if you have, for instance, using RDP. So there's a lot of different policies that can actually disable these features, because I'm pretty sure that most users don't actually care about those different animations and so on. Another thing is that when should you choose between 32-bit and 64-bit? I always found the 32-bit package much more reliable. Also, remember to remove products that you're not going to use. So exclude them from the configuration XML file. Always try to run the latest version if possible. Funny thing about the shared computer support licensing feature, it's been bugged in 3 different releases. So suddenly shared computer support licensing stopped working, so we had to roll back to another version and so on. So important to be aware of. Antivirus, remember to exclude the Office packets as such. You can have real-time scanning on, so it can look at the attachments and so on. Sizing of the RDS environment. Remember to have adequate storage I/O, memory, and RAM. And if you're unfamiliar how to optimize or configure an RDS host, Vmware and Citrix have free tools that you can use, which can basically configure an RDS host for you. You can disable unneeded services as such. So basically download a tool and run it. I can do a lot of free configuration for you. And I've seen a blog from Citrix that after running these tools, you can have about 20% extra users per server. Now, if you're running Hyper-V, please check your NIC drivers, because VM virtual machine queuing on the NIC drivers is always a giant pain in the something. So be aware, if you're having slow or virtual machines running slowly on a Hyper-V host, please check your NIC drivers if you're running Broadcom and such. And there is also some RemoteFX specific policies that we can tune to minimize the bandwidth usage, which makes RDP act a bit more snappy. And if all else fails, I've seen it a couple of times that you're starting Outlook in RDS environment, you have more than enough bandwidth. There we go. And you have more than enough bandwidth, but the Outlook logo or the Outlook startup icon takes a lot of time, and then suddenly Outlook drops. What we can do is that in Office 2013 Service Pack 1, we have another protocol called MAPI over HTTP, which is much more bandwidth friendly than the older protocol. But I've seen cases where it's stops working and we need to resort to the old version, which is RPC over HTTP. So that can be disabled. It's not something we can do by group policy, but we can do it using registry scripts. So I'm gonna jump into a demo. Just hopefully everything works. There we go. So this is a plain virtual machine running 2012 R2. So what I'm going to do is I want to install Office 365 on this host. First thing I want to do is going to run the performant analyzer tool, which I'm already pre-installed. I'm just going to run a basic exchange analyzer check. I just need to type in my Office 365 address. So this is going to run. It's going to take a couple of minutes. I'm going to jump back to that afterwards. So as I mentioned, I want to install Office 365 on this machine. So this is pretty much this is the deployment tool. It's an exe file. I was quite disappointed, but that's the way it is. So as I mentioned, it has 3 configuration modes: /download, /configure, /packager. So what I want to do first is download Office 365, a specific version. So I specify setup /download, and I specify the configuration file I want to use. So here I have a configuration file that I specified a specific version. I've excluded the applications I don't use, and I've set up accept end user's license agreement. So all these different XML variables. I can't remember every variable I can use in a configuration XML file. It makes no sense at all. So I can either go on the technical article and scroll down and read all the different variables, or I can go into a website that Microsoft has created, which will basically allow me to dynamically create the XML file for me. I don't need to remember all the different variables. So here I can specify if I want to use 2013 or 2016, specify what kind of language I want. And now it builds the XML file for me. So I can go in. This is going to create the download part I want to use. Properties, auto activation. Let me see, the last thing I want is to exclude some applications because I don't want access. I don't want OneDrive for Business. So just click export, and now I have a configuration XML file that I can use to download Office. So what I can do then is basically just do setup.exe and find the key part to get the backslash. Never mind. I can do setup.exe /download, point to the XML file. What it's going to do is going to download Office, create a subfolder where Office is stored. So this is basically the package for Office 365 32-bit for the specific version I specified. So the next thing I can do then is create an installer XML file. Because now I have them stored locally, I can move them to a network share. And then I can create a new configuration XML file where I then specify the version number and the path that the installer should get the source from. So I can download it and run it. Then I can do the same again. Setup.exe /configure and then point to the XML file, which will then install Office 365 Pro Plus. So I can just jump back to the client performance analyzer, which has done a couple of tests from my endpoint. Tests the specific ports that Skype or Office 365 uses. DNS server out of region. Makes sense because the DNS server is running locally. Checks the latency to Office 365, which pretty much is between 40 and 60, 70 milliseconds. Also checks the bandwidth, and it also checks the specific TCP settings on my host. Now, Windows Server 2012 R2, the TCP profile is based upon having a local area connection. It also has another TCP profile when communicating with or going out to the internet. So in that case, I should go in and change the TCP settings for the internet connection. So it's a known TCP profile for internet connections going out. So just going to close this window. So now after I've run the installer, I've installed Office, I've pre-installed it, so I cheated, but didn't want to waste your time with that. So then I have all the Office applications available on my desktop. Start Outlook. Oh, crap. So there's the first error message I get if I didn't activate shared computer support licensing. So I get this error message, and when I click OK, it will close automatically. Now on the other hand, you also saw that I got a pop-up window in the right lower corner screen, which is the configuration analyzer tool, which basically checks if I've basically configured Office as I should. Now, as I mentioned, in order to do shared computer support licensing, I can either configure it using the XML file, or I can change the registry. So I'm just going to change the registry to save a lot of time. There we go. So, what would happen now if I haven't activated before I started the session? I will get a dialog box. I needed to authenticate with my Office 365 username and password. That's because I don't have federated access set up on this environment. Now, also, all the steps I've done to this point is basically the steps I need to create a gold image if I want to deploy Office 365 as part of my image. So there's a command line that you can use which basically checks the licensing which is running. So this should be empty if you want to install in a gold image. You basically deploy Office 365 using shared computer support, and when you run the OSPPW script, it should be a blank, because you shouldn't have any activations enabled and so on. And also, I can go into the licensing folder, which is basically the local app data profile of this user. I go into the licensing folder, and here are my activation tokens stored. So now we install Office, activated shared computer support licensing. What we need to do now is the tuning part, which is basically done using group policy. So what we need to do first is basically download the administrative templates for 2013 or 2016. Place it on the policy definitions, or central store as it's called, on the DFS share or the domain controllers. So when we start group policy management, so first I'm going to do is going to go into computer configuration and policies, administrative templates, and here we have some Office 2013 policies. So the first thing I'm going to configure is the updates part, because I want to manage updates to Office 365 using group policy, because then I can specify, let's say I want to have some users using the later version, or 2016 for instance, or some users only using an older version. So I can specify it more granularly using group policy. So for instance, I've specified an update path. Where should Office get updates from, which is pointing to a network share. Hide the option to do enable and disable updates from the console, or from within Office. And I can also disable automatic updates and upgrades. If I want to do an update, I can then change enable automatic updates to enable, and then we'll go look for a new version on the share. Now, the other thing I want to do within computer configuration, if I'm running RDS, is to configure or tune the RemoteFX policies. So if I go into Windows Components, scroll a bit down, and I have Remote Desktop Services, Session Host, and I have session environment. And here I have some specific policies that I've enabled. Limit the maximum color depth, which can be up to 32-bit. You can change it down to client compatible or 16-bit, which will then consume a lot less bandwidth. We can also go in and specify the compression algorithm that RemoteFX uses, so that we can either be done using to optimize less memory, but I've always seen that we have more than enough memory on the host, so I always change it to use less bandwidth. And configure RemoteFX adaptive graphics also to minimize bandwidth usage, because then you can get a lot more users on the RDP hosts, and the user experience might get a bit better. So now, after we've done with that, we need to do a bit more configuration on the different parts of Office. Then I go into the user configuration policy, administrative templates, and here I have a bunch of different Office policies that I can configure. I start with going into Microsoft Office, and then I have something called First Run. I want to disable the First Run movies and Office First Run pop-up screen when a user starts Outlook for the first time or Word. I go into the miscellaneous tab. I disable any animations, Office backgrounds, disable the Office start screen. Because when you start Word and it's enabled by default, you get a list of different templates you can choose from, or where you want to open a file from. Because when I have this enabled, I start Word and goes directly into the mobile. I can start typing. And I also disable something called Use Hardware Graphics Acceleration. Now, when you're running Office in an RDS environment, this is disabled by default. But I've seen in specific environments that it seems like a bug, but you might get some black toolbars and things stop working, sessions drop out and such. So what I typically do is go in and enable the do not use hardware acceleration. So it's going to be grayed out when I open Outlook afterwards. And also suppress the recommended settings dialog. And also here I have the automatic activate with federated credentials policy enabled, so I can change it to disable or enable the using group policy. But you need to be aware of that it's by default activated in the Office client. So the last thing I want to do is change Outlook. First thing I want to do is go into the account settings, email exchange, cache mode. I disable or set up the cache mode settings. How long should my OST file store data? So I specify it to 3 last months. Specify that I should use cache mode for existing and new profiles. And here I can also specify if the OST file should contain, or the cache mode should contain headers or the full email item, so including attachments and so on. And lastly, I need to go into the miscellaneous tab, PST settings, and then I specify the default location, which in that case should be a network share, and we use the variable username, for instance, to store the OST file in network share. So, if I now go into Word, I go into Options just to make sure that every policy is working as they should. Go into Advanced, and then I can see that, just have to find it, background recapturing is disabled. I can find that the hardware graphic acceleration is disabled, subpixel positioning, and so on. So there's no fancy animations, running 16-bit color, doesn't consume a lot of resources, and so on. Same if I go and start Outlook. As you see, there's no animation when I start Outlook as well. I go into File. Oh, my bad. I wanted to go into Account Settings. Account Settings. Change. I can see I have cache mode enabled with 3 months of data. Okay, so the last part I want to show you of the demo is Skype for Business using optimization pack. Because as I mentioned, if I'm running Office or Skype for Business video call, for instance, on an RDS host, it's going to consume a lot of resources, CPU, memory, and GPU if I have it present. So this is running from inside a Citrix environment. So I already have the components installed. I have another computer here that I'm going to have a video call with myself. So I'm going to start Skype for Business. Automatic login, and after I've installed the components, you see I got another icon in the right lower corner screen. HX real-time connector is connected, which means that the Citrix session and my computer have a direct connection. So I'm just going to start a video call with myself. I might just turn around because I'm there we go. So, seems to be working as it should. If I look at the resource usage, Skype for Business is not using a lot of CPU or memory. And if I go down to my local computer and look at the resource usage, just go into the resource monitoring tool. So if I now go into the network activity pane here, I have something called the media engine service, which is basically running the audio and the video channel on my local computer. I can now see, let's double check the IP we're located on, 10.15.1931. Yeah, so I'm guessing this now has a direct connection with this endpoint. So I have a pretend Skype client installed running the media service, but from the end user, looks and feels as it should and is running on a remote session. So that's pretty much everything I wanted to show you. Any questions? Good, I think. Okay, then I want to thank you for your time, spending the last hour with me. If there's anything else, I will be here for the next 10 minutes or so. Thank you for your time.